All right, let's get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining the Center for New American Security this afternoon for our panel discussion on investing in strategic readiness. My name is Hannah Dennis. I'm a research assistant here in the Defense Program, and I'm honored to be moderating this fantastic slate of defense experts to discuss this very timely topic. I'll kick things off with a few questions for our panelists, but we want to invite you to join the conversation too. You can submit your questions online by typing them in the chat below the video on our website, or you can tweet your questions with the hashtag CNAS 2022. Please note that this panel is being recorded and will be available later on our website and on our YouTube channel. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. Today we have with us the Honorable Katie Wheelbarger, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs during the Trump administration. While at the Pentagon, Katie oversaw policy issues with allies and partners in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere, which I'm sure yielded a lot of insight that we're very eager to draw on today. Katie has also worked on the Hill in both the Senate and the House, and today Katie is the Vice President for Global Program Support with Lockheed Martin. She's going to be able to provide us with an industry perspective and be able to talk about some of the challenges facing the defense industrial base, so we're really excited to have her here. We also have Kimberly Jackson, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Readiness, a role in which she advises the Secretary of Defense on strategic and operational readiness for the armed services. Previously, Kimberly worked as an international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation, and she was also an officer in the Naval Reserve and held assignments in the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, the Naval Special Warfare, and in the Chief of Naval Operations Strategic Studies Group. All of this is to say Kimberly is going to be a great resource today for understanding challenges to readiness and the department's plans to overcoming them. And then lastly, we have my boss, Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. So as part of our research here, Stacy and I recently published a report called Precision and Posture that assesses how well the DoD has resourced its strategy of deterrence. And we zoomed in on two key areas of investment. Those were critical munitions and posture in the Pacific. That report was the catalyst for us convening this panel. And so I'd like to direct my first question to Stacy. So Stacy, we focused our analysis on PGMs because it's one of the few areas that we can make significant changes to our current capability. So how would you characterize the Pentagon's acquisitions of PGMs since 2009? Have we been buying them in sufficient quantities?
Thanks for that, Hannah. It's such a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel. So precision-guided munitions were the area that we focused on, PGMs, and the short answer is no. I would characterize our purchasing history since 2009 as insufficient, unbalanced, and inconsistent. So I'll just unpack that a little bit. Insufficient, we have tended to buy lower quantities of these critical munitions than we think we'll actually need, or that we've proven to actually need in real operations in the world. And this is in part due to the fact that the Defense Department had shifted to a focus on efficiency and just-in-time sort of supply of different munitions. And that seemed to work well enough most of the time, though there were a number of different instances during real-world contingencies where our stockpiles ran low. This problem was particularly acute because we also supply a lot of allies and partners who rely on us for these exact same munitions. Unbalanced, by that I mean that the portfolio is weighted in one direction, and that is towards unitary warheads that are against ground attack. So, and short range. So we have tended to focus on munitions that we could use in the operations that we've been undertaking, which were against terrorist organizations or the Taliban in Afghanistan. And in those situations, it was a permissive operating environment. So aircraft could loiter over our head and could use direct attack munitions like JDAMs and just drop bombs when a target presented itself. When we think about having the types of PGMs that we would need for a conflict against China or Russia, a more capable adversary, we need longer range systems that allow our aircraft and our ships to stand off so that they're not within the range of adversary attack, and a little bit safer. We also need a different mix of munitions. We are certainly going to be looking at probably being able to hit fixed ground targets, but at the same time, we're going to want to take out ships if we're thinking about a Taiwan scenario, or go after distributed ground forces, which requires different types of warheads. The final piece is inconsistent, and Hannah knows this well because she did the very innovative analysis that we had to look at whether the department was actually presenting a stable requirement to industry. And it's often we've heard from so many senior leaders that munitions are bill payers in the budgeting process, meaning that they tend to get cut. And we don't actually buy what the requirement is or what the plan was. And Hannah's analysis showed that this is actually very true. There were pretty wild swings in a number of the PGMs that we looked at over time. In addition, the department often didn't follow through on the numbers that it planned to buy in the 5 years defense plan, the FIDUP. So these two factors made it really difficult in terms of creating a stable requirement for industry.
And to our viewers, if you want to learn more, we strongly encourage you to take a look at the report. You can find that on our website. But in light of some of those shortfalls and gaps that Stacy talked about, let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. The president has already used his authority to draw down on American military stores of weapons no less than 26 times in the last year to provide Ukraine with more than $19 billion of support, including 1,600 Stingers, 8,500 Javelins, almost 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter artillery shells, and more. These drawdowns have stirred some debate about the effects that they have on U.S. readiness, which is one of those concepts that is really difficult to define and hard to measure. So I want to turn to Kimberly next. Can you sort of explain what strategic readiness is, why it's important, and how munitions factor in?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for being here, Hannah and Katie. As I said, it's great to meet you virtually. And Stacy, it's really wonderful to see you on screen. And thanks everybody who's dialed in. So I'm really glad you asked about what strategic readiness is. It's a question that we get all the time because my office in Force Readiness, we're trying to advance the concept and the acceptance of strategic readiness throughout the department. And really all of our lines of effort are going towards supporting that goal. Really, at its basic, strategic readiness is a more holistic and inclusive view of readiness than how it's previously been thought of. And I think there's been a lot of really interesting dialogue. General Berger and General Brown talked about this in War on the Rocks almost 2 years ago, that readiness has often been conflated with near-term availability. And we're really endeavoring to try and expand that view. And we're working on a definition that we hope to have finalized in the next several months. But I'll tell you a little bit about what that definition is, and then I'll unpack that. And then to address your question, Hannah, tie that to how we're thinking about munitions. So strategic readiness is the ability to build, to maintain, and to balance warfighting capabilities with our competitive advantages so that we as a department can achieve our strategic objectives across threats and also time horizons. There's a couple things in there that I just want to highlight. The first is I use the term balance, and I think that really focusing in on balance is key to understanding what strategic readiness is. It's thinking about, and I mentioned, warfighting capabilities and competitive advantages. Those are different things. Those require different things to be ready. Those require different levels of readiness, and there are different timelines associated with both as well. So it's really balancing also between what is it that we need to address in the near term, but making sure that we're balancing those priorities, balancing those investments so that we can still compete over the longer term and that we can be ready in the future as well. And that requires as much information as possible to make sure that we're making those trade-offs in an informed way and an open-eyed view about what risks are incurred in that trade space. The other piece that I want to highlight about it is that when we say threats and time horizons, it's not just looking at the near term all the way through to the long term. It's also about being more inclusive about what fits into that concept of readiness. So we always focus on operational readiness, and operational readiness is an absolutely critical component of strategic readiness. But there are so many other aspects that we also need to include, and we need to be able to assess and to measure so we have a broader view of whether we as a nation are ready or not. Things like the resilience of our critical infrastructure, our ability to mobilize the reserve component, our ability to attract and retain a talented workforce, both in the military and on the civilian side. So you asked, Hannah, what does this have to do with munitions? Well, I think a few things. First, it's that balance that I was talking about, making sure that we have the munitions on hand that we need in order to address any contingencies that might arise, but also making sure that we are investing and divesting as necessary of those munitions so that over the long term, we are able to have those munitions on hand that we might need, whether that's for operations, whether that's for deterrence, et cetera. Another piece of that is thinking about the munitions that we have. Again, it's not just focusing on operational readiness, but we have to include components, especially as we think about the National Defense Strategy and the imperatives that it puts forward to operate under the view of integrated deterrence. How do we incorporate our allies and partners into that concept of strategic readiness and the way we think about what munitions we need? And if we're going to be fighting alongside our allies and our partners, how do we incorporate our notion of and our understanding of what munitions they have and what they're planning to have in the future? Think about things like modernization, another substantial dimension of strategic readiness. It's not just about what we have on hand now, but are we making thoughtful decisions? Are we putting prudent planning into the system? And are we allowing for flexibility so that we can divest and modernize so that we have what we need into the future?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think we'll get a little bit more into that balance and the role of allies and partners in a little bit. First, I wanted to turn to Katie and ask, over the last 9 months in the war in Ukraine, we've seen how quickly a lot of these weapons are being consumed, and that certain weapons have played a really significant role. Early on, it was the Javelin anti-tank missile, the Stinger man-portable air defenses, and then later the HIMARS firing long-range rockets, which has really enabled Ukrainians to target key Russian rear areas. So those weapons are making a real difference. Why can't industry just build more quickly? And can you kind of speak to how long it takes to expand certain production lines, and what are the main factors that drive those timelines?
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And thank you again for hosting us today. I'm really excited to be able to talk on this topic. If there's any benefit that's come out of the war in Ukraine, it's a heightened awareness of some of these challenges. I think those in the defense space, particularly the think tank and congressional world, have looked at this for some time, have worried that we may have a munitions gap, so to speak, and that we've, as Stacy described, have been using munitions as a bill payer for far too long. So again, having this conversation so broadly, I think is a benefit that we're experiencing from the industry side. Look, coming out of the events of February 24th, we all recognized, I think, pretty rapidly that we were going to need to do what we can to increase capacity as quickly as possible. Our CEO in particular immediately said, let's invest as much as we can to expect the demand to increase. But at the same time, we are facing some, structural limitations. I think Stacy mentioned some of these in her introductory remarks, which is lack of stability in demand and funding makes it really hard to be sure that you know where you're investing appropriately. I mean, at the end of the day, we are a publicly owned company, and we owe it to our shareholders to do wise investments. And as much as we want to increase capacity quickly, we also have to know whether there's a stable demand stream that's going to be there for the long term. I mean, in the past, I think industry has potentially seen demand increasing, and then that has dried up, and they're stuck with excess capacity and having to explain that and the cost implications. But there's also, in some ways, we're dealing with we're the victims of our own success in some ways as an industry, and that we actually do produce pretty complicated weapon systems that work really, really well. And we do it at scale and scope that's that we come to almost take for granted. And so just the expectation that we will be immediately able to increase that capacity to fourfold is because we've just gotten used to being really good in some ways. But at the same time, we are dependent on a somewhat, you know, I guess I would say, like Stacy said, just-in-time delivery type model of inventory that flows down through the entire supply chain. So every time we want to increase capacity, you're talking about having to renegotiate with every single supplier across the board of those weapon systems. And so not only do there's inherent time that it takes to build these munitions. I think what my team told me, from contract to build and delivery of key munitions is about a 2-year time frame is the average. So there's a little bit of expectations management of what you could think you can do fast. So if we need these things today, we need to be planning for them at least 2 years before. But there's also the supply chain challenges that are even more acute in an inflationary environment, because you're trying to get on contract with suppliers who don't exactly know what the cost of things are going to be 6 months, 8 months, 2 years from now. So, and the longer that those negotiations go forward and the more complicated they are, the longer it takes to actually, again, get on contract and start building for the countries as soon as possible. But so those are some of the key things that we see. I do want to highlight that I think, again, like I said at the beginning, there's been a revelation coming out of Ukraine that I think is equally applied to the Indo-Pacific, that Stacy, that your report, Hannah, your report has highlighted, that we realize how quickly in a state-on-state conflict we're going to burn through these key capabilities, and we really need to start planning now for the eventuality a few years from now.
Definitely. And so these are some serious obstacles that you're talking about in ramping up production. I know there are several areas in the defense industrial base that have become pretty consolidated and just pretty fragile, with a lot of single source supplied critical components and just not a lot of slack, which you kind of touched on. Stacy, can you talk a little bit about how we got here?
Sure. I think it's worth being mindful of the fact that the munitions being shorted compared to major weapons platforms like ships, aircraft, tanks is something that is actually not new. I found a CBO report from 1988, so still during the Cold War, that was highlighting the fact that our stockpiles of key missiles were low. And in fact, that of 21 out of 30 of these missiles were at 50% or less than what the military had specified the requirement was. So I think for actually very practical reasons in the budgeting process, sometimes, you can actually cut a buy of hundreds or thousands of missiles more easily than you can buy a fraction of a ship or an aircraft or a tank or vehicle. These weapons end up getting shortchanged. But in general, like you said, Hannah, the defense industrial base has really consolidated, and particularly on the munitions and missiles part. And that's because this is a defense unique item. And since the end of the Cold War, there's been a real emphasis on efficiency, which is all very good. But at the same time, that has led to just this consolidation, and key components of some of these weapons, whether it's the energetics or rocket motors, which are in the news right now, end up being real big limiting factors to being able to expand our production going forward. So I think that as we prepare for and think about how to strengthen deterrence against China and Russia simultaneously, the long-term pacing challenge and the acute threat, we're going to have to recognize and come to terms with the fact that we're going to have to actually spend more money to invest in and have a resilient industrial base and supply chain for these missiles and munitions that will be needed.
So Stacy got at this a little bit. I think since the day after this most recent war in Ukraine started, we've been hearing about lessons learned. And we're closing in on a year now almost. So I want to turn this back to Kimberly and ask what DoD has learned from the experience in Ukraine, specifically about our critical munitions stockpiles, how DoD has made adjustments to improve, and then overall whether our assistance to Ukraine has diminished U.S. military readiness today.
Sure thing. Thanks, Hannah. A great set of questions there. So please let me know if I didn't answer any particular aspect of it. More than happy to. Don't want to dodge anything. So what I would say, we've learned a lot, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head. Pretty much right after Russia invaded, we started to have to really flex as a department to figure out how was it that we were going to maximize the amount of assistance that we could provide in a timely way while still preserving U.S. readiness, right? And the level of assistance that we have provided, I mean, that is an endeavor that we haven't seen that type of fervor, that type of energy, rightfully so, in a very, very long time. And so that meant you have a number of actors who needed to be involved and a lot of information that needed to be considered in order to provide the right decision support to the secretary and to the president. I think right from the beginning, a number of us across the enterprise recognize that we absolutely need to have a process that can help foster predictability, which is a theme that I'm very glad to hear that both Stacy and Katie have been mentioning over and over again, because that predictability is so important for us to be able to assess ourselves, assess our operational and our strategic readiness, for us to be able to provide predictability to the Ukrainians and in terms of what assistance they can expect that we'll provide, but also to remain as responsive as possible, because if we've learned nothing else, we know that as a department, we have to be prepared for contingencies, right? So that gave rise to the development of what I think is a really remarkable process. It is a responsible and rigorous process by which we can take those requirements that are coming in from the Ukrainians, we can validate them within the department, and we can make sure that everybody who has a stake in this decision-making and in providing assessments to our senior leaders has that same information from which to draw those assessments. And that is that might sound simple, but for anybody who has worked in or around the department, it really can't be overemphasized how hard that actually is, because when we talk about tracking our munitions, there are different ways of tracking munitions, of understanding what is in which specific inventory and where it is in the world, and understanding what it's being used for. And none of it is the wrong way to do it. It just might be different depending on which organization you're talking to. So really at the foundational level, we had to figure out a way to make sure that we understood what munitions we had in our inventory in a standardized way, and make sure that that was as transparent as possible. So then we could create a process that helped to facilitate decision making that, again, has these tenets of being predictable, right? It helps to, what we needed to be able to do was have that information available to as many of us as possible, and then be able to overlay that. What are the requirements? What's the inventory? And also, how do we assess what those readiness impacts are when we do provide some of this assistance? Even if we provide one shell, one missile, there is an impact, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative. That can also be positive in terms of helping to accelerate modernization, right? In terms of being able to accelerate divestiture. But the important piece is that, and what my office does is we're the dispassionate analysts, right? We have to present the information of, if we are going to present an option to senior decision makers and ask them to use that information, we have to articulate what impacts that decision might incur and for how long that impact might be felt. And make sure, again, that all of that information is as standardized and trustworthy as possible, meaning that we are making sure that we are talking to the experts. For example, the Joint Staff J4, for example, OSD's acquisition and sustainment folks. They've got a lot of information that we wanted to make sure that we were looking at accurately and transmitting to the rest of the department so that we can accurately identify what those impacts are, and not just for the sake of providing that decision support, but really ensuring that when we have that picture, we have a better idea of what options are available to help mitigate some of those impacts as well. You had also asked about whether this has diminished U.S. military readiness. And Hannah, I think that that's a question that's asked all the time. Look, what I would say is that the United States military is a strong and resilient force. And there are, as I talked about in my description of strategic readiness, there are a number of ways to measure readiness. And fortunately, our munitions stockpiles are not the only way that we measure whether we are ready or not. We have built-in complements. We have built-in redundancy. And we have ways of identifying how, if we are incurring impacts, how can we mitigate those impacts using the rest of the strengths that are resident within the joint force. So I think that there are a lot of ways that we are looking at those impacts, and we are assessing those impacts over time. And that information alone can really help us understand not only ourselves, our readiness as a department, but I think tying it to a lot of the things that Katie had said, providing predictability not just to the defense industrial base if we need to signal that we need more production of a particular munition, but also to our allies and partners, and telling them, hey, here's the help that we need from you, or here's the assistance that we'd be looking for as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think while we're talking a little bit about solutions and steps forward, I want to turn back to Katie and ask if you can help us define the problem a little bit more, specifically the particular challenge of producing munitions just because it's such a defense unique item. I mean, there's not really a commercial market, is there? So I guess sort of what kind of bottlenecks and other obstacles do you encounter in this process?
Right. Yeah. Similar to my previous comments, I think, again, like you said, since it's such a defense specific requirement, it all comes down to supply chain, having consistency and availability of those key components, whether they be rocket motors or the metals that are needed, or the explosive material. We sometimes have to rely on small and medium-sized businesses that are sole source. And, I know for example, through the pandemic, the large primes, at least my company, did as much as they could to sort of pass through payments as early as possible to these small suppliers to kind of keep the supply chain afloat during a somewhat difficult time. So and then you also have workforce challenges, right? This is a somewhat technically complicated, as well as factory-based production line. And so it's not just, you have to have a trained and capable workforce. I've had the benefit since I've joined the company to visit a few of our factories. And I'll just do an anecdote that I like to say, because I went with Undersecretary LaPlante when we went to Camden, Arkansas to look at our HIMARS and our GMLRS lines. And I took the opportunity to talk to some of the folks on the line. And this is sort of a small town, somewhat company town, people who've worked in these factories, their grandfathers, fathers, and now them are there. But you talk to the workforce, and they took me to side and said, my kids thank me when I come home at night for supporting the good guys. Whereas like never before did my kids care what I was doing. But now, they appreciate what I'm doing at work. But the point being, it's an anecdote to say how much I think the defense industrial based workforce really understands that their role that they play in the defense of this country and the survival of freedom around the world. But at the same point, it's still a very specialized workforce that we have, and we do all we can to increase training capabilities from your trade schools all the way up to your MITs of the world. But those aren't things that happen fast. And especially when you're talking about increasing capacity that would involve sort of brick and mortar investments, like doubling whole lines. The necessity to have, as we've been saying, the stability and consistency and confidence in the continued demand is something that that industry will look for in order to really do that kind of investment to let's say double a production line.
So Kimberly, in light of the obstacles that Katie has laid out, and also in light of just the usage rates that we've seen by Russia and Ukraine, is the DoD making any adjustments to its requirements with munitions? I think you may be muted.
That makes sense. This is basically the first month that we've been dealing with pandemic-induced Zoom calls, right? So, sorry about that, everybody. So, I think it's a great question. I think that it's important to start with essentially first principles here, which is any time that we're talking about planning and talking about understanding and projecting requirements, those are well-established processes, and anybody who's been involved with them can tell you that they take a very, very long time for us to adjust. And I think that what it has highlighted for us is that something that a lot of us already knew is that we have to constantly be questioning our assumptions that go into that planning, right? And I think with every lesson that we have learned, and with every day and every week that we're providing another package of these PDA packages that we're providing, we are learning more about our system and how we can make it more responsive, and how in the future, when we're adjusting these plans, when we're adjusting these requirements, how do we take those lessons learned and incorporate those back in? I think that the department is often accused of not being innovative, right? And while some of those criticisms I think are perfectly legitimate, I think what we have shown in this process has been we actually are quite innovative, and we are adaptable. We're able to take a lot of these lessons learned and move really quickly, and we're going to be able to incorporate that into our planning and really be honest with ourselves about how maybe some of our assumptions were not as accurate as they could have been. And this is what we do all the time, anytime that we are involved in a contingency or in an ongoing operation. But it has also allowed us to look at some of our planning assumptions that have been correct, right? And I think anytime we can have more information like that helps us refine those plans and our assumptions in the future is a positive thing.
Definitely. Again, Stacy, talking about the high consumption rates that are driving a lot of this discussion that Kimberly has been laying out. I know these aren't new trends. This is something that we see a lot looking back. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that we looked so far back in our report was to kind of learn that history so that maybe at some point we can escape this cycle and won't have to repeat it. So can you talk a little bit about PGM use rates in past military operations over the last few decades?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, PGMs go back to at least the Vietnam War, when the Air Force began to use laser-guided bombs. It was really the first Gulf War in 1991 where they received a lot of attention. But in that war, they were only 7% of the total munitions used. We've seen that a percentage increase over time quite steadily as the United States has realized the benefits of being able to accurately hit a target, which means that they can cause less collateral damage. They actually can be more effective with fewer weapons. In the wars against Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and 2003, the opening phases of those, about 60% of the weapons that were used were precision weapons. And then when you fast forward to 2011, when there was the air war over Libya that deposed Gaddafi, in that conflict, which was a relatively small one, 100% of the weapons used were PGMs. And that was a big jump from what we had seen in the 90s in the Balkans, where most of our NATO allies didn't have their own stockpiles of PGMs. By Odyssey Dawn, or they couldn't actually drop the weapons. By Odyssey Dawn, they could. And then with the air war over ISIS, in particular in the most intense phase from 2014 to 2019, I think nearly all of the weapons employed were PGMs. And what was really shocking with this last conflict was the amount of weapons that we dropped. It was much more intense than the counterinsurgency phases of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A report that Becca Wasser and I and a bunch of others wrote at RAND, we noted there were over 115,000 PGMs used in that conflict. So that brings us back to the principle that while precision is really important and it is hugely effective, that you still need mass in some of these conflicts, especially protracted ones. And that we can't forget that if we're going to be preparing for a war against a potential great power adversary, in order to deter it, that we're going to need larger stockpiles than we've typically planned for.
So Stacy just laid out a few instances in which we came close to falling short. And I think part of why we want to discuss those instances is so we can avoid them in the future, but also because we're still dealing with some of the ramifications from the ways that we had to work around those issues at the time. So I wanted to turn to Katie and ask a little bit more, just diving a little bit more into this history. Most recently in the headlines, in the war against ISIS, the U.S. ran low on key weapons like JDAMs and Hellfire missiles. And I know industry really significantly expanded its capacity at that time to produce those weapons because we needed to respond to that urgent demand, but then was left over with a lot of excess capacity. So can you talk a little about what happened there and how that experience still shapes industry's perspective today?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I wasn't with industry at the time, so I don't have firsthand knowledge of the experience of trying to ramp up capacity and then have sort of a cliff at the exact time that happened. But I can say it definitely is something that is a memory across a company, that that there's a potential to make a massive investment because you are being told or believe that there's going to be a demand or there is a demand signal before it's actually on contract. And so you've invested in capacity and built a line to a certain level, and then there's no longer a contract vehicle or demand to actually make a return on that investment. So those kind of experiences feed this loop that I think we're somewhat experiencing in terms of some reticence in some quarters to invest and increase capacity as much as possible before there's actually a pretty concrete evidence of that actual demand. One of the places we see it the most from my perspective, so one of the parts of my job is to do the I do the domestic side of international sales, meaning helping our company when they're trying to sell overseas, make sure we're aligned with U.S. government policy, and because most government or most foreign sales are government to government agreements. Anyway, coming out of Ukraine after February 24th, we saw an immediate uptick in potential demand, especially if you think about, that weekend and even the weeks after, those foreign partners pledging to send their munitions to Ukraine. It was obvious then there was going to be a backfill that was going to be needed. But the time lag to actually get that perceived demand into an actual contract vehicle or an LOA for, signed, that makes us, corporate America, confident that they can increase their lines. Unfortunately, it's not as immediate as you would think, even in a situation like we've seen in Ukraine. We did, like I said at the beginning, we did take the initiative to invest to increase capacity at the front end. But at the same point, I think the demand signals are higher than what we're seeing right now actually get kind of signed and into the system as fast as you would hope.
I think it's a really valuable insight and important for policymakers to kind of understand that as we go forward and those obstacles. So very grateful again to have you here. I want to shift now to the Pacific, but first I wanted to ask Kimberly, and this gets at a few of the questions that we're starting to see come up in the chat. So please continue to push those out, and we'll try to incorporate them into the conversation. But Kimberly, we know China and Russia are the priority right now, but the world does have a tendency to surprise us. This gets back a little to what you talked about with balance, I think across time and across threats. How can you ensure that the DoD doesn't over-index on one scenario or threat so that we can remain ready for a range of situations and try to avoid being caught flat-footed?
Yeah, absolutely, Hannah. And I hate to beat the strategic readiness drum over and over, but that's what I'm paid to do. So might as well adopt that. Listen, it's about balance, right? It's strategic readiness. It's about balance. We are not foregoing the absolute need to be ready in the near term, because we are thinking about readiness from a strategic perspective. It is about ensuring that we are able to conduct the operations and respond to the contingencies that we need, that we can't predict, that emerge. Because as you said, the world has a tendency to surprise us. This is something that we have seen even with the example of Russia invading Ukraine. That's not something that we planned for years before, right? So we need to be able to have our processes enable the predictability that allow us to plan and to resource into the future and to think thoughtfully about how we divest, how we modernize, how we ensure that readiness for years out, but at the same time have enough flexibility built into the system and into our decision making so that we can respond, we can be agile when things like that emerge. I think the second component of what you asked about, and this is something that I do want to make sure that I emphasize is that listen, I'm a process person. Okay. I'm not a munitions expert. So love that I'm talking about munitions. But the reason why I think this is so interesting is because we have been able to take a contingency, to take a problem that has been posed to the department and figure out a responsible and rigorous and repeatable and somewhat agnostic process that can be applied to a whole lot of different readiness challenges, right? Even if that process were perfect, and of course it's not, we're constantly iterating on it. Even if all of the data that we had and all of the analysis that we conducted based on that data were absolutely perfect, that still does not ensure that we have any kind of strategic discipline necessarily, right? That is a human component of what we're talking about. I am always going to be a huge proponent of having as much quality data and as efficient and sensitive of processes as we possibly can to enable the best decision-making possible. But there's also, in order to be disciplined and make sure that we have the resources and the capabilities that we need in the future, that means that we as decision makers have to have real and tough conversations about whether or not we're willing to incur those risks that are presented to us with every single choice that we make.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think setting aside this idea of alternate contingencies and just looking at specifically Russia and China, which we often lump together, which as I just did, there are some big differences between those two theaters in terms of what we need to procure. So Stacy, I wanted to turn to you and ask, are we buying enough of the right munitions specifically for the Pacific, and where are we lacking?
So this ties back to what my opening remarks about our portfolio currently being unbalanced. And that's in a couple of different dimensions. There is the range issue. We had previously focused on short range PGMs. We've begun to shift and are starting to buy more of the long range systems, but not enough. Beyond range, though, it's important to remember that geography matters and that the Pacific is very different than Europe. The Pacific Ocean's a big place filled with sharks, fish, and clams, and we need to be prepared for a different type of war there, one that probably involves a maritime component, especially if we're thinking about a Taiwan scenario. Given that, we need more anti-ship munitions. We need some of the long-range ones like ALGrazum, which right now the Air Force is planning to have bought 179 by FY27, which is just not enough if we are planning to defend Taiwan. That would be enough to load out either 9 B-52s or 7 B-1s, and that's not going to get it done. So we need more anti-ship munitions. In addition to the long-range ones, another area where there is a fairly significant gap involves mid-range munitions. So we have a lot of shorter-range fighter aircraft that are going to be critical in any of these different situations, and they don't currently have anti-ship weapons that give them a modest amount of standoff, so we can buy more of them. They're not going to be as expensive as the really long-range missiles, and that's something where I think the department needs to be shifting some attention and trying to figure out how to fill that hole.
So Stacy mentioned the ALGrazum, and I think from my understanding, the ALGrazum and the JASM share a single production line. So I wanted to turn to Katie and ask what would need to be done because of that fact if we wanted to expand the production of ALGrazum, as Stacy has said, we likely will want to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And I just want to highlight the cooperative relationship we've had with the department, particularly over the last 6 months on looking at this very question and harnessing authorities like multi-year contracts to try to increase capacity by creating a stability of the supply chain and long lead parts. So I think we have a very robust and cooperative effort right now. And we are all looking at the problem and seeing it similarly to how Stacy has described it. From our perspective, I mean, we've already made significant investments to include expanding our Troy, Alabama facility for the express purpose of increasing both JASM and LRASM. As you said, they are the same, they use the same line, but because there's 70% commonality. So there's actually benefits to having, I mean, it's just about, what the target is, but they're very similarly situated as munitions. But again, we are looking to be able to increase the capacity right now on both weapons to like 1,100 combined is the goal we're working towards. So recognize that we've been perhaps as a country underinvesting in these munitions to date, but from my perspective, we have the right investments in place and the right cooperation with the Department of Defense at this time to really work for increasing this necessary capability to deter the Indo-Pacific conflict that we worry about.
It's really good to hear that those conversations are happening and that it's being taken really seriously. While we're still talking about the Pacific, there's another key factor that I wanted to raise for discussion, and that is posture. So, Kimberly, many people have criticized the past several administrations for failing to do enough in the Indo-Pacific to improve U.S. military posture there. In Stacy and my recent report, we found that there have been relatively few investments in new facilities and infrastructure in the Pacific, though that might be changing with some new construction in Australia and the Marianas and the Philippines. But the other piece of posture is forces, which can be permanently based or temporarily deployed in the region. But most allies and partners don't want permanently based American forces. And the growing missile threat to bases means you probably don't really want to concentrate your forces either. So can you talk a little bit about how the allocation of forces to regions can help contribute to U.S. posture in the Pacific? And then also whether that process, if there is a way to ensure that those forces are available for the Pacific and not reallocated to the Middle East or Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Hannah. So what I would say is anytime we talk about posture, right? Whether we're talking about the infrastructure, as you mentioned, or the forces, the question that always should come before that is, what are we trying to achieve, right? And I think that very often within the department, outside the department, we think of posture as the easy button, or as the proxy for having presence, and for that being the proxy of achieving our objectives. And I don't know that that's always necessarily the case. We talk a lot about balance, right? We talk about needing to have different options to be able to achieve our strategic objectives. And posture is certainly one way that we can do that. But every time we're talking about should we increase posture, the question that I want to ask is what is it that we're trying to achieve? Because we have a number of levers at our disposal that can help us perhaps achieve some of those same effects, right? Because posture is not the only way that we can have presence, and presence isn't the only way that we can achieve our objectives. So I think starting with those principles and asking that question, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve, knowing that, and I'm glad you raised allocation, our allocation process, and more broadly our global force management process, is something that is actually, it comes under a lot of criticism, and I think that it's a bit unfair, because it is a well-run, very robust process that allows us to have a lot of these flexible options. Of course, listen, there are all kinds of improvements that we can make to any of the DoD processes that define what it is that we do. But it allows us the flexible options to be able to allocate either in a planned way or in a contingency manner, to make sure that the combatant commanders or those who are generating demand signals in response to the requirements that are given to them, that they get the forces that they need. And whether or not that is presence, whether that is reassurance, whether that is to provide exercise options for our allies and partners, I think that there are a number of questions that need to be asked before we turn to posture as or increasing posture as the definitive solution. There are a number of other levers that we should be exercising, and that we do exercise as a department, given that there is always going to be an inherent tension between supply and demand that is at the core of understanding readiness. We have to be able to articulate what those levers are, and in order to be able to do that, we have to start with what is it that we're trying to achieve.
Hannah, I think you're muted.
I'm so sorry. We're going to move to audience questions soon. So I just wanted to say, take a moment to remind people that you can submit them in the chat below the video. And then you can also tweet them with the hashtag CNAS 2022. So while those last questions are coming in with our last 10 minutes, I wanted to focus my last few questions on some more of the potential solutions that we've laid out that we would like to lay out for the problems that we've discussed here today. There are a number of proposals that have been floated to improve the U.S. critical munitions stockpile. The House and Senate NDAAs have provisions to create a critical munitions fund to enable the U.S. to supply allies and partners without raiding U.S. military stocks. So I want to go to Katie first and then Kimberly. Do you think that the $500 million critical munitions fund that has been proposed will help solve the problem and protect U.S. readiness? So Katie first, and then we'll go to Kimberly.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll defer to Kimberly on the readiness question as inherently her purview. But I think, look, my perspective is, and especially in the last 6 months, the Hill has been incredibly forward-leaning in its support for Ukraine. And then looking at the munitions question, we've seen a number of provisions that is getting at the heart of this challenge, which is trying to increase our overall capacity that can be used both domestic by, the U.S. government consumer as well as our allies and our partners. To date, pretty pleased with the Hill's efforts to fund and for both the United States and our allies. I don't want to really speak specifically to that fund as much as to say, like, anything that can contribute to consistency of funding, as we've been talking about, I think this whole hour, is the key to making sure that we can have a consistent, elevated capacity production across the board on all these key munitions. So I don't think it could hurt, but I think, again, it's one of those. It's one solution. I wouldn't say it's the solution to the overall challenge of making sure we have a consistency of funding.
And Hannah, I would say that maybe in the interest of time, knowing we've got a lot of really great questions coming in, I agree with what Katie said. I think that anytime we talk about readiness, we're talking about essentially supply, and additional funding is just an additional lever to be able to increase that supply. So certainly no issues, no challenges to that. And I think that in order to make sure that we are providing Congress the information that they need to keep us accountable, that process that I described that we've set up to make sure that we're all operating off of the same data so that we have a more accurate picture of what our inventory is and what our readiness is. And I think that can only benefit the type of accountability that Congress is looking for.
So it sounds like there is at least a glimmer of hope, but a lot more work to be done. One of the other sort of levers, as Kimberly put it, that we've heard from Secretary Bill LaPlante is the idea of multi-year buys for precision munitions. And I think Katie touched on this a little bit earlier as a good possible solution. So I want to go back to you. Can you talk a little more about what you think about bulk buys and whether there are any other steps that DoD can take to improve industry's ability to meet the PGM requirement? And then I think we have an audience question that dovetailed into this, just talking a little bit more about what the prospect of multi-year buys would look like for industry.
Right. No, I'm happy to take that on. And yeah, I did sort of mention this briefly before because we're working with the department to really potentially implement a multi-year procurement contract for multiple key munitions that are vital for the Indo-Pacific. I think from our perspective, they are needed urgently to shore up the defense industrial base. Unlike platforms, munitions have never really, like we've discussed at length today, haven't really received that kind of stable funding that you need to actually grow capacity significantly and stabilize that capacity over time. And I do think these multi-year procurements, again, when you're looking at it from a business perspective of needing to negotiate with suppliers who also need to know that there's a long-term demand signal that will be met and paid for, it really helps a great deal. And I would say that those benefits are compounded in an inflationary environment where you can sort of lock in certainty in an uncertain economic situation.
Fantastic. I have one last sort of question, and I'm going to weave in Two questions from the audience talking about the role of allies and partners. So I'm going to send this back to Katie, and then Kimberly and Stacy, if you want to add anything on at the end, that would be more than welcome. So we've talked a little bit, I think someone briefly touched on the role that allies and partners can play. There have been ideas like co-production and co-development that have floated around DC. So I wanted to ask Katie first, do you think ideas like co-production could help? And are there any particular allies and partners that offer promising opportunities for this in the near term?
Yeah, absolutely. My previous job at the department was all about allies and partners, working closely with multiple regions of the world. And, operationally, there's nothing we can't do anything unilaterally, whether it's overflight or just simply posture. We need partners and allies to not only recognize what we want to do, but also contribute and participate. I think increasingly, particularly post-Ukraine, the same conversations we're having here about our vulnerabilities and maybe our lack of capacity, partners and allies are realizing the same thing. And they want more capability in their countries and in their theaters than exists right now. And so we are, as an industry, I think, really looking at what we can do to support that demand. But, the challenging part is ensuring that the supply chain is there to support it. We want to be careful about developing production lines, thoughtfully, that make sure that we're not competing against ourselves for the same limited supplies. So if we can, it's about building resiliency into the system and sort of increasing the net pie rather than, again, like I said, competing against ourselves. And of course, we have any number of allies and partners across the world that we're looking to partner with. I think particularly in the Indo-PACOM region, we're talking about munitions in particular, having capacity in theater and potentially being able to, build and sustain those capabilities in theater. So you operationally cut down the time distance challenge of a potential fight in that region is something that we're looking to support in conjunction with the USG. Of course, private sector doesn't build munition production lines in another country without full support of the US government.
Stacy or Kimberly, would either of you like to chime in on that?
Sure, I'll jump in if Kimberly's not going to. I would just say I agree with everything that Katie said. We came out in our report and argued that this is a promising area. And I think in particular, when you look at really close allies like Australia, I know there's been some discussions about having some sort of ALGrazum, but it really does have to actually expand our supply chains rather than place more strain on them. You think about Poland too, they wanted to be building HIMARS in their country. It would make a lot of sense for them to also build and stockpile GMLRS there. And I'm sure there are many other examples.
Kimberly, anything from you?
I think that Katie and Stacy both said it brilliantly. The only other thing that I would say is that it's about options and it's about flexibility, right? If we're talking about supply being something that is inherently finite, how can we explore options to open up that clamshell and really be able to see what those other options are and do that in a way that is not necessarily going to provide any negative impacts, for example, Katie talked about to the supply chain, because that's finite as well.
Well, I think those are really great points of hope that we can end on today, and possible solutions to look to in the future. So I want to take this moment to thank our panelists and thank our audience. This has been a really great discussion, and we hope to see you all at the next one. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.